Let's now turn attention to the Middle East, where to the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas. Now, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned that Israel will use enormous force against the Hamas militant group. He says the Israeli Defense Forces' retaliation for the worst attack on Israel's soil in decades has only just begun. More than 700 people have been killed in Israel since Saturday's surprise attack, including 260 people massacred by Hamas gunmen at a music festival. Since Israel began striking Gaza in response, nearly 600 people have died. Israel's defense minister earlier ordered a complete siege of the Gaza Strip, cutting off food, fuel, electricity, and water supplies. 9 U.S. citizens are now confirmed dead in Israel, while more than 10 British citizens are feared dead or missing. Dozens of people remain kidnapped by Hamas and their families, and their families are desperately searching for information. Now, for further discussion on Israel-Hamas war, I am being joined on the news by an international affairs analyst, Dr. Jide Ojo. Good to have you join us, Dr. Ojo.
It's a pleasure. Good evening.
Good evening. Let's start by getting your reaction to the attack on Israel by Hamas and how this particular war has evolved in the past 3 days.
Well, first and foremost, we need to understand that this has been on for 5 decades, since 1973 during the Yom Kippur War between the Arabs and Israel. And Israel was able to overcome in 1973, and since then, we have had the formation of Hamas that was involved in the advocacy for the restoration of the land of Palestine. Now, even in May of 2023, there was an attack on the Hamas by the Israeli forces that led to about 36 deaths on the side of Hamas and 1 death on the part of the Israeli. Unfortunately for Israel, with all their intelligence, paraphernalia, the sophistication of their technology, they did not see the Hamas massive attack on Saturday coming. And it has led to global shock, because as you have rightly pointed out, about 700 people have died on the part of Israel, and overall about 1,000 people have died in the course of this conflict. Of course, Israel have the Israeli authorities met yesterday evening, and they have promised massive retaliation, saying that they are going to into a very massive and sustained war against Hamas. But all this boils down to one thing. On both sides, there are justifications for the aggression. Hamas felt Palestinian land has been illegally taken by Israel since 1973, and they want the restoration of their rights, the land and all of that. On the part of Israel, they felt after suffering so much during the Second World War, they also need to exist, and they have claimed a place for themselves. The UN resolutions have been there in the last 15 years, which has talked about having a two-state solution, which will have evolved a win-win solution on part of Palestine and on part of Israel. Unfortunately, the UN has not shown sufficient political will to drive through these reforms that will have led to lasting peace.
Well, Dr. Joe, many people will say that, look, the UN is only as strong as its member states. So it's basically not the UN, perhaps the division, like an evidence of the division among countries at this time. But I also wanted to ask you, because we're seeing the first move by Hezbollah to get involved in this particular war. How concerned are you that some other terrorist groups and organizations might take advantage of what's happening on the ground? And then is this also is there a prospect for fresh regional war in the Middle East?
Of course, it has started. Hezbollah, from Lebanon is poised to also attack. And this will mean that Israel will be fighting on several fronts to have its existence fortified. Because with Hezbollah and Hamas, you don't know whether Al-Qaeda will join in. You don't know whether Al-Shabaab will join in. You don't know whether other militia groups, ISIS, may also weigh in. And that will mean that Israel will need global support to be able to, be able to continue to exist. Because Israel, as we know it, is a very small country, but has been largely protected by America and its Western allies like France, Germany, Britain, and the rest of them. But my fear is that if this is not properly handled, it can lead to a Third World War. Because as it were, you could see that the Muslims are largely backing the Hamas and Palestine, and the Christians are backing Israel. And aside from that, you now have a scenario where even in Egypt yesterday, a policeman allegedly shot and killed 2 Israeli tourists, which means that this is already getting international dimension. And you want to ask yourself, when would there be lasting peace in the world? We have on our hands right now, Ukraine-Russian war. We have Sudanese crisis in Africa. And now we have this, Hamas versus Israel, face-off also brewing. I think leaders of the world, global leaders, particularly the members
perhaps,
of the
Dr. Joe, like you rightly noted, it is the religious dimension to this that makes it rather complicated to resolve. Thank you so much for your time. As always, international affairs analyst Dr. Jide Ojo.